All right, well, let's bring in now political analyst Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast to weigh in on the first day of the Lekgotla meeting under the government of national unity there. Prof, it's always great having you with us. A very good afternoon to you. So the ANC says that it's convening to take some stock of many issues that actually led to their recent as well as historic electoral decline that saw them lose their majority for the first time in 30 years. They've cited, among other issues, factionalism that often leads to breakaway parties that directly compete against its mother body, and have pointed out to political fragmentation that is causing political instability within the party. But do you think this is an accurate view from the party?
Yes, I think he was on point, but it's all talk and no action though. The speech of the president this morning was well balanced, largely because he touched on domestic issues. There was a great deal of emphasis on inclusive growth and the fact that one of our macro policy objectives is to achieve high levels of economic growth, but our economy has not been growing the way it should have, largely because corruption is not just a buzzword, but is institutionalized both in the public sector and also in the private sector. But also, as I indicated, we've had a slow pace of economic growth because there is a presupposition that if you grow the economy, later on you will have a trickling down effect, that the spin-offs will be felt by the poorest of the poor on the ground. But that has not happened. But also he touched on international relations, that our foreign policy is inspired by the culture of human rights, rule of law, and so on. But he was sort of like laying down the law in terms of issues of ill discipline. And I agree with his characterization that there is a connection between voter turnout and a slow pace of service delivery, that the ANC suffered a setback in the main at local government level, in particular in urban centers. But there's nothing new about that. The ANC has been saying all these sorts of things. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I think the ANC has not struck me as a party that has drawn lessons from what has happened of late in terms of how it was dealt with a blow in a big way. So they need to showcase a paradigm shift in practice, not only in theory.
And speaking of that paradigm shift there, Professor, I mean, they've also undertaken and committed to actually going back and looking at their pre-election manifesto, the 6 key priority points, namely that jobs plan, the economic development and growth that you just made reference to, the high cost of living, service delivery, defending democracy, as well as building a better African world. But now the party is not the executive, remember. How possible are these goals then from being implemented, especially within the current government structure? Does the party, do you think, still have a heavy influence in terms of governance under the GNU?
The ANC was voted out of power simply because it broke the social contract. It has been making a lot of commitments that it has not honored, and its arrogance of power has caught up with them. I think also we've seen of late an appreciation of where power resides, because some of us, we normally think that power is confined to the market forces, but also we've seen that even the voters, they do have power. Hence, they've decided not to give the ANC an absolute majority. But the ANC will have to do more than what it has done in the past if it wants to do well in the upcoming local government elections, which are just around the corner. It might suffer a worse blow than it has suffered if it is not drawing lessons.
And speaking of lessons, Prof, I mean, looking at the party's current position, I'm going to refer back to the GNU as one of its founding members. I mean, I'm sure you've also heard the noises that are developing around how this government was actually formed. Do you foresee potential threats then to the organization itself dipping even lower in the upcoming local government elections, and a possible weakening overall from their current structure within the GNU? And what would you attribute then as being the biggest factor or factors in this regard? For example, Prof, the message by the voters was clear. You've just made reference to it, that they did not want an ANC rule, but it was what was then formed afterwards, what the voters were pointing towards.
President Ramaphosa said that the conception of GNU was embraced by all and sundry in the ANC. I take that with a pinch of salt, because why would you have, for instance, other members of the ANC breaking ranks? I mean, the members of the ANC in Gauteng are very critical of the GNU between the ANC and the DA. In the main, of course, it includes, among others, other political parties. But I think also as political analysts and also even yourselves as media practitioners, I don't think that we've been critical in terms of questioning the intellectual history of this concept of a GNU, because I don't think that we can make a disjuncture, in my opinion, and I think it's a mistake even the president has made to distinguish between a GNU from a coalition formation, because coalition is basically power sharing, and the same goes to a GNU. It's about politics of accommodation. So there has been no outright winner. So how do you begin to say that the current government is not a coalition but a GNU? But to respond to your question, there are threats. I mean, if you look at the assertions by Helen Zille, even the statements that were made by ANC members yesterday, I'm not going to name names, it showcases that the coalition partners don't speak the same language, that different understandings and interpretations, because the DA says it is in a coalition with the ANC, and that coalition resides with the DA and the ANC in the main, but other ANC members are speaking a different language.
Absolutely, and that brings me to my next and final point, Prof, because the ANC president also spoke of the party actually sort of toying with the idea that was actually presented by former President Thabo Mbeki for a national dialogue. Now, is this a feasible option, you think? And how would you like to then see this engagement being facilitated and followed through by the party?
Our democracy is a byproduct of democratization. I think the first national dialogue that we had was CODESA 1 and CODESA 2 in the early 90s. But South Africa has a history of having national dialogues which don't yield positive results, which are also confined to the political elite. For instance, if you look at the national dialogue that we had of late, the one that was convened by the Deputy President regarding power sharing, it was also limited to the political elite without the inclusion of civil society, and also the inclusion of people from rural areas. So I think the people who set the agenda should not only be technocrats and politicians, but should also be ordinary people. But also the discussions should not only be limited to power sharing, but also should focus on those who have been relegated to the margins of the economy. And, issues of land must be discussed, issues of economic development, inequality, poverty, and unemployment.
Prof, I know I said that was my final point, but I just want to make a quick reference to your earlier point when you spoke about the issue of accountability within the party. I mean, when the party speaks of renewal, which the president also touched on in his opening remarks, we have seen quite a few examples of how inconsistent some of their policies regarding cleaning up the organization are actually implemented. So what do you think it will then take to change this narrative that certain members within the organization are exempted from accountability and discipline just by virtue of being affiliated with the right faction at that particular time?
There's a need for a major shake-up within the ANC. One of the problems of the ANC has been ill discipline. The notion of step-aside principle has been applied selectively only to purge those who don't belong to the dominant faction. But also the ANC has not done enough in terms of rolling out political education. You cannot have a comrade, for instance, regardless of a political organization, that doesn't have political education. It takes 3 years or more than 3 years to produce a solid comrade. But if you look at the members of the ANC who've joined the ANC since 1994, they've been politically baptized into factionalism, not into political education. So the ANC needs to emphasize the issue of political education, because one of the reasons why there is ill discipline is the lack of inculcating political education amongst ordinary members of the ANC, including senior leaders of the ANC.